So you're in Florida in 2023, and you've got a problem. Your schools are teaching children about slavery, and pretty much about the darkest chapters of American history. And you can't have that. So you do what any good revisionist would do. Actually rewrite history.
Well, I can tell you what has zero educational value, and that's lies. Okay, telling people that the enslaved developed skills which in some instances could be applied for their personal benefit is a white devil damned lie. Slavery wasn't no vocational school. Nobody enrolled in slavery so they could learn a trade.
But this isn't just a minor thing, like changing a few textbooks or rewriting some lesson plans. This is about something much darker. It's about controlling how an entire generation understands their history, about reshaping the narrative of an entire people. You see, when you control how people learn about their past, you control how they think about their present.
The idea is they're trying to say that there was literally benefit to enslaved people from their experience of being enslaved. And this is like saying, you know, your whole family was killed in a car crash, but you really learned how to deal with grief.
And Florida isn't stopping at slavery. Remember Rosewood? A prosperous black town burned to the ground by a white mob in 1923? Remember Ocoee, where dozens of black citizens were slaughtered just for trying to vote? Now, they're teaching children there was violence on both sides.
And they gentrified our neighborhoods, now they gentrifying our past and our history. They really trying to take credit for how resilient we are as people.
To make it seem that the people who were victimizers were actually victims, and people who were victims were actually victimizers. Yeah. The most pernicious part of this, however, is not the dishonesty, not the outright lying on people and who lost their lives, but it's the purpose of it.
Yeah.
They do this in order to uphold an unjust and unfair state of affairs in the nation.
But to understand what they're trying to hide, we need to go back to what really happened in places like Rosewood and Ocoee. Back to the truth they don't want your children and the younger generations to know. So what's going on in Florida? In July of 2023, the Florida Board of Education approved new standards for teaching African American history. On paper, it looks simple enough. It looks like just another curriculum update. But the devil is in the details. Because in reality, it was one of the most ambitious attempts to rewrite Black history in modern America. They made key changes that would reshape how children understand one of the darkest chapters in America. First, they decided that slavery wasn't just oppression. No, according to them, some slaves actually benefited from their enslavement. They learned skills, they developed abilities, they became better workers. Want to see how absurd this narrative really is? Let's talk about the Tennessee state capitol. In 1845, the Tennessee government rented 15 black men from an enslaver named A.G. Payne to carve out the capitol's limestone cellar. These men were so skilled that the state paid their enslaver more than double what they would have paid white workers for the exact same task. By Florida's logic, this is a success story. Look at these highly skilled black laborers. Their expertise so valuable that they're worth twice as much as free white labor. But here's what Florida won't tell you about these same men. Two of them were brothers, Robert and Daniel Payne. After years of making their enslaver rich with their valuable skills, Robert had to fight in the Civil War to win his freedom. Daniel, despite becoming literate enough to teach his own children to read and write, died in poverty. In fact, every single of these skilled craftsmen died penniless. These men built one of Tennessee's most iconic structures. Their expertise was so valuable that their enslaver made double the profit. But the moment they were no longer someone else's property, all those valuable skills meant nothing in a society that saw them only as former slaves. They're buried somewhere in unmarked graves in Middle Tennessee. This is the kind of benefit Florida wants to teach your children about.
Why does he want teachers to teach about slavery in these other places? Because the argument is America was just another country that had slavery, no different from anybody else. But America was different. America was the only country that had slavery in which the enslaved were not people, but property. That was a unique American contribution to slavery.
But they didn't stop there. When it came to teaching about racial violence, Florida got creative. See, they had a problem. How do you teach children about massacres where white mobs burned down entire black towns, murdered families, and stole their land without making white people look bad? Simple. You blame the victims. The new standards require teachers to include acts of violence perpetrated against and by African Americans when teaching about racial massacres. At first glance, that sounds fair, right? I mean, if you're learning history, you'd want to learn about the entire picture. But take a look closer. Specifically, Rosewood, 1923. A white woman in Sumner falsely accused a black man of assault. Within days, a white mob burned an entire black town to the ground. They murdered men, women, and children. Survivors had to hide in swamps for days to escape. Those who survived lost everything: their homes, their businesses, their community. The death toll was somewhere between 30 and 150 black residents. The number of white attackers arrested? 0. After the violence, the town ceased to exist. Not a single black resident ever moved back. The survivors were scattered across Florida, forced to start over with nothing. Most took on manual labor jobs, working as maids, shoe shiners, or in citrus factories. Even the land was stolen. Almost all their property was sold for taxes. A town that once represented black prosperity was wiped off the map, physically and historically. Or look at Ocoee, 1920. When Mose Norman, a prosperous black farmer, tried to vote, a white mob didn't just kill him. They went on a rampage, burning every black-owned building in town. They lynched July Perry, a black landowner, and left his body hanging as a warning. By the next day, Ocoee's entire black community was either dead or driven out. Before the massacre, Ocoee had 255 black residents. By 1930, there were just 2. Yes, you heard that right, 2 residents. The message made by the white community was clear. If you were black and trying to vote, you wouldn't live to see tomorrow. This wasn't just about Ocoee. The massacre sent shockwaves through black communities across Florida. Voter registration plummeted. The threat of violence kept black citizens away from the polls for generations. Ocoee itself remained effectively a sundown town until 1981, more than 60 years later, when the first black resident finally moved back. What happened in Ocoee was a blueprint for violent voter suppression that would echo throughout the South for decades to come. So you see, these aren't both sides stories. These are massacres on an unbelievable scale, documented, proven, undeniable. But Florida's new curriculum teaches students to see these events like they were some kind of equal conflict, as if the black residents of Rosewood and Ocoee somehow shared responsibility for their own destruction. This is the gaslighting of an entire younger generation. But this isn't exactly a brand new strategy. There have been many instances throughout history that governments and powerful institutions have tried to control their people by controlling how history is taught. Take India, for example. Right now, they're literally erasing chapters about religious tolerance and pluralism from their textbooks. They're removing major historical events that don't fit their narrative. They're even renaming historical structures to match their ideology. Or look at the Philippines. They're busy rewriting their textbooks to make a dictator look less like, well, a dictator. But perhaps the most successful example of historical revision happened right here in America after the Civil War. See, something fascinating happened. The South may have lost the actual Civil War, but they won something perhaps even more valuable. They won the war over how that history would be taught. Southern states pressured textbook publishers to completely rewrite their story. They created something called the lost cause narrative, painting the Confederacy not as defenders of slavery, but as noble warriors fighting for states' rights and traditional values. In their version, slavery wasn't that bad. Confederate leaders were heroes, and the South's defeat was just a tragic loss of a noble way of life. And here's the mind-blowing part. This fantasy version of history didn't just stay in Southern classrooms. It spread north, infected textbooks across the country, and shaped how generations of Americans understood the Civil War. For decades, millions of children learned that the Civil War wasn't really about slavery at all. Sound familiar? Because that's exactly what Florida is doing right now. They're taking real historical atrocities, slavery, massacres, systematic oppression, and rewriting them to be more comfortable. But let's be clear about something. When you teach children that slaves benefited from their enslavement, that's not education, that's indoctrination. When you tell them that massacre victims shared responsibility for their own deaths, that's not history, that's propaganda. And when you systematically erase the horror of what really happened in places like Rosewood and Ocoee, that's not protecting children, that's programming them. So what happens when a state tries to erase its history? Well, people fight back. In Miami, Dr. Marvin Dunn, a psychology professor at Florida International University, attempts to preserve the actual events of history. He founded the Miami Center for Racial Justice in 2020, but that was only the beginning. He created something called the Teach the Truth Tours. These aren't your typical field trips. He takes high school students, their families, and teachers to actual sites of racial violence, making sure they see the real history Florida wants to hide. Ironically, in 2023, Dunn learned firsthand that this violent history isn't just in the past. While leading a tour in Rosewood, a white neighbor tried to run him and his group over with a truck, shouting racial slurs. The incident led to federal hate crime charges, proving exactly why this history needs to be taught and not erased. Meanwhile, across Florida, teachers are finding creative ways to tell the truth. Despite the new restrictions, despite the pressure to water down history, they're refusing to participate in this erasure. But let me be the devil's advocate here. What's really at stake? Shouldn't we just forget about all of this? Aren't things better now? When you teach children that slavery wasn't that bad, when you tell them that massacre victims were somehow responsible for their own deaths, and when you erase the systematic destruction of Black communities from history books, you're not just lying about the past. You're programming an entire generation to misunderstand how we got here. And more dangerously, you're making it easier for history to repeat itself. Because that's the thing about erasing history. It doesn't just disappear. It leaves a void. And in that void, old lies can become new truths. If you made it this far and enjoyed this video, it would mean the world to us if you were to subscribe to the channel and help share this video with others. We take pride in the message of our channel, and sharing this content will help us get the word out. This was Black Stories Untold, and as always, thanks for watching.